Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. The American dream is on life support. If you don't believe it, just look at the difficult challenges facing the current generation of young men and women. A chronic shortage of well-paying jobs, sky-high college tuition and monumental levels of student debt, and a treacherous long-term outlook for those men and women who never get a college degree, which is still a majority of the population. We're fortunate to be able to talk about this with my guest, Tamara Draut, a friend and colleague of mine at Demos, where she is the Vice President of Policy and Research. Tammy, how are you?
I'm great, Bob. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming by. I appreciate it. You know, let's start by explaining for those who don't know what Demos is.
Okay, I'm happy to. I love to talk about Demos. So Demos is a public policy organization founded with the mission to really address two things, political and economic inequality. And we do that through a combination of strategies, research, advocacy, litigation, and really aggressive and smart communications.
So that's cool. And for those who don't know, I am a distinguished senior fellow at Demos, and it's really a great outfit. Now, you wrote a book a few years ago called Strapped, Why America's 20 and 30-somethings Can't Get Ahead. And it showed how difficult it was for young people in the U.S. to get a foothold on a decent standard of living. Now, with the recession and its aftermath, things have only gotten worse since then. So tell us a little bit about what you found at the time, and then compare that with what's facing young people today.
Yeah, one of the most disturbing things is that my book was actually written in 2006, way before the recession, and there were all sorts of warning signs here that this was going to be the first generation that would not be able to achieve or surpass their parents' living standards.
Right.
So for young people who come from non-privileged households where, you know, mom and dad don't have college degrees, what we've seen, and we saw it in 2006 and it's only intensified, is that they're making a lot less than their moms or dad did back in 1980. And just to put a fine point on that, young men with no further education behind high school are making 75 cents on the dollar compared to their dads. Women are doing a little bit better, but because they started so behind. But here's the big trend is if you look at all young people who are millennials, there's only one group that now today at the median makes more than her mom, and it's women with college degree.
Tell us who the millennials are again.
Yeah, so millennials are the people that know how to, you know, tweet and do all that. They're born 1980, 1981. And so they're in prime family starting years, prime college going years. So it's an important stage of life.
You know, it's not just about standards of living. I mean, you need a certain income pretty early on to get a foothold, to get a real start on adulthood. For those who want to get married, maybe start a family, make that first down payment on, make the down payment on that first home, and that's becoming increasingly difficult. Now, I think you guys at Demos have been looking at this. Are you seeing that folks are delaying marriage and buying homes and that sort of thing because of the economy?
Yeah. There's several impacts of student loan debt, and I'll focus for now, but I hope we talk about what it does in terms of distorting choices about where to go and whether to finish college, because that's pretty important too. But what happens is, let's say they graduate, which is a successful start from college. You know, the amount of student loan debt, which is now averaging about $30,000, does two things. One, it gives 22-year-olds really tough choices right out of the gate. Should they put some money away for retirement savings, for a down payment on a home, or really tackle that student loan debt? The percentage of young people that are buying homes and the age at which they're buying is falling. It's one of the reasons why we still don't have a robust housing recovery in this country, because young people with college degrees, you know, primary first-time homeowners, aren't able to get their foot in the door in the sort of post-financial environment, which has much tighter down payment requirements and tighter mortgage standards. And then Demos did a study looking at if you take a college-educated household that doesn't have any student debt and a college-educated household that does, and make assumptions about how much they can contribute towards retirement, how big their down payment on their first home will be, add all that up, and your typical two-person household with student loan debt is going to lose close to $200,000 over their lifetime in terms of wealth accumulation because of that trade-off between paying $200 to $400 a month for student loans. That money's not going into a retirement fund. That money's not going into a down payment for a home fund. And it has real implications.
The population we're talking about is enormous. I mean, there's $1.2 trillion in outstanding student loan debt out there. 40 million people have student loans. 7 million are in default already. The question arises about whether some of these folks can ever catch up. I mean,
yeah, one of the really disturbing statistics is that about a third of student debt is actually held by people over the age of 40. So we think of student debt as something that hits 20-somethings. You know, this stuff lingers. You can't discharge it in bankruptcy. So student loan debt is with you for life, pretty much regardless of your circumstances. That needs to change. We definitely need to end this idea that student loan debt is really the only form that can't be discharged, where people can't get a clean start. And if you have federal student loans, watch out, because if by age of 65 you're still paying back student loans, you can have your Social Security garnished.
that is really outlandish. I mean, all right, don't get me started.
Well, it's outlandish because, you know, Bob, you know this, like, higher education historically in our nation has been the primary lever for upward mobility,
Right.
for helping people get ahead and do better, you know, achieve the American dream, which is to have a better quality of life than your parents. You know, that's why parents get up and go to really tough jobs in fast food or retail where they're not treated well and not paid well. It's so their kids won't have to do that. And we've really broken that promise in the last generation with this debt for diploma system that is a really radical shift from
really
how we
is.
used to provide opportunity in this country.
Exactly right. So Demos is campaigning on this issue. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so we believe we have to do two things to solve this problem. The first is we have to give some kind of relief to existing borrowers that have $1.2 trillion in student loan debt. So bankruptcy, refinancing, loan forgiveness would be great, but, you know, refinancing and reforming the bankruptcy laws are going to be a hard enough fight as it is. And then we need to tackle the root cause of the problem. And that means making sure that we do bold action now so we never get to $2 trillion in outstanding student loans. And that means getting states to reinvest in higher education. You know, the majority of kids, 75% of young people, go to a state university or college. The way historically states, universities, and colleges have gotten funding is through states. It was socialized. It was a collective responsibility. That's no longer the case. Today, almost half of all states in this country take in more revenue through tuition than they get from the state. So we've privatized and individualized the chance to get a college degree in this country.
So you had to navigate these shoals yourself when you were coming of age. Talk a little bit about your background and what it was like getting started for you.
So, you know, this is one of the reasons why I went into public policy, because I can really see in my own life just the tremendous shift. So I was lucky enough to be born to parents that had a great work ethic, but also my dad had a union job. He didn't have a college degree, he had a union job at a steel factory. My mom had a good job. Once my youngest brother was old enough, she went back to work. Together, they were able to pay for my college. I didn't take out one student loan. I actually didn't even work during the academic year because public policy at that time kept tuition low by funding the state universities. I went to Ohio University. I can't pass up an opportunity. And left in 4 years, which is now an exception, and left without any debt. And that enabled me to come to New York City and begin a journey that I've been on for 20 years.
It can make all the difference
All
in the
the
world.
difference in the world.
Now, we've been talking about youngsters who are fortunate enough to go to college, get a degree, and that sort of thing. That's not the majority of American young people. So what's happening out there now, and you focused on young people like this in your book,
Yeah.
Strapped. What's happening with young people who don't get through college or don't go to college at all?
This is, I think, a piece of the story about this generation that isn't actually getting enough attention. there's a couple things happening to young people, and I'm so glad you keep saying who are the majority that don't have four-year college degrees, because a lot of people fail to realize that. It's about 2/3 of all young people. A couple things are happening. Their unemployment rates are still relatively high, particularly for people of color. You're looking at double-digit unemployment rates still. Their earnings power. If you just think about, back when I was growing up and getting ready to go off to college, GM was the nation's largest employer. $18 an hour was, the norm. Today it's Walmart.
Right.
That alone, just that example, gives you a sense of what parents of this generation can afford, and they can't afford a college degree. So it means they're probably not going to college. They have depressed earnings, and the ability to really work their way into the middle class, which was a real option a two generations ago, is off the table. You can't work your way into the middle class working in retail, working in fast food. For most people in those professions who are trying to feed themselves and their families, moving up is not going to be a real option.
And this is an enormous issue, obviously not just for young people. It's a tough employment market out there for people of all ages. There's so much low-wage work. Much of the work is now contingent. It's part-time, it's temp jobs. You don't get the kind of benefits that workers once got. Now, in addition to make it difficult, obviously, for individuals and families, there are long-term economic implications for the society as a whole. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are a low-wage nation. And there's no end in sight. If you look at the jobs that are going to be created over the next decade or two, it's retail, it's food service. We have registered nurses, but I don't see any big national plan to greatly increase the number of registered nurses we have. So, there's real implications about how we are going to accomplish economic growth if we don't do anything to raise the floor of the people that, in my opinion, make this country run.
Well, I think an interesting thing that you talked about, we never like to talk about class issues in this country, which is really a shame. But you'll talk about what we used to call the working class in the United States. You don't even hear that term that much anymore. The working class has evolved, it has changed, but there is still a large working class in the United States. Who comprises the working class in America in the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, the working class, again, the majority of Americans, if you want to define it by not having a college degree, it's much more female because you have women working at much higher levels, particularly women that don't have college degrees. It's much more people of color. And over time, it's probably going to become close to majority people of color. But you're right. Working class as, a word, as a description has sort of fallen out of fashion, unless you're talking about the old vanguard, the blue collar, white working, hard hat, steel-toe boots. But I'm encouraged because I think what we're seeing now in the fast food worker strikes and the Walmart strikes and the federal contractors that managed to strike and get Obama to pass 1010 for federal contracts. We're seeing something we haven't seen in a long time, and that is a movement for economic justice. And I think the beginnings of a movement that for the first time is cross-gender and cross-race. And that needs to be sustained because the reality is if the only way we're going to fight this money in politics that dominates what happens in this country and whose interests are served in Congress is if we have a real movement of the new working class.
One of the things I think is interesting is we talk a lot about those old union jobs, how important they were as a gateway to the middle class, and they were really important. But people forget that those jobs were not always great jobs. I mean, they started out, they were low-paid work, they were lousy working conditions, they were often dangerous. It was as a result of public policy and especially unions that those jobs became good jobs and changed standards of living in this country. Is there any reason why we can't make today's low-wage work, transform them into decent jobs that could then be a pathway to a higher standard of living?
Only political will and the will of business. It used to be, we had a social contract that held up pretty well in this country where government, businesses, and workers all worked together for shared prosperity. Businesses and government walked away from that a couple, decades ago. So I do think it's possible, but we have right to work states where it's impossible. The workers, Volkswagen workers, came so close to voting in a union, and you had the governor getting involved and spreading a lot of threats that if they voted to join the union, they wouldn't open a new plant. So you have a level of aggression and belligerence toward workers, low-wage workers, that are just simply asking for a right that people lost their lives over in this country, which is the right to democracy on the job and a seat at the table.
Now you, if I remember correctly, supervised a study at Demos about what the possibilities are and what the economic implications would be if low-wage retail workers' salaries were raised.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Well, we found that if you made the floor of a retail job at the big box retailers that we all go to, if you raised it to $12.25 an hour, which is not that generous, we're talking $25,000 a year for full-time work,
Right.
you could lift close to 1 million families out of poverty. You could contribute a lot of extra points to GDP, and you'd also get some new job creation, because the reality is, we know that when households earn more, particularly at the bottom of the wage scale, they spend that money.
Exactly.
And when they spend that money, their earnings is somebody else's revenue to create new jobs. And one of the problems we have right now is we don't have enough demand. Households are really stretched financially, and they're not able to make the kinds of purchases they were before the recession.
Which is why we're having so much trouble getting the kind of economic growth that we'd like, because consumer purchasing is 2/3 of the economic growth in this country, and people just don't have the income to spend. They should listen
right.
to my
Well,
guest.
and we have another option that has never been on the table because of the politics of today, and that is that the federal government could be spending money to put people to work to repair our highways, our bridges, to finally get us an updated grid for our energy. So to make the United States again a real leader in innovation and infrastructure, which we are not anymore.
In terms of sort of the national conversation, that's not even on the table anymore. I mean, people aren't even talking about infrastructure, which I think is like really crazy. One of the things that happens is that because of our anti-tax policies and because of the wars that we keep fighting, we don't have the revenues that are needed to make these kind of investments in human capital and that sort of thing in this country. So, I opened the program by saying that the American dream is on life support, which I really believe, and which is so hard to accept now, because it was the United States that sort of created this idea of a vast and reasonably secure middle class. You mentioned what's going on with low-wage workers. There have been strikes and protests and demonstrations. Are there other reasons to be optimistic? Can this be turned around, or are we doomed to this sort of low-wage environment for years to come?
Well, I'm an optimist at heart, and I think as much as that like Demos, our theory of change is that profound transformation happens when you have people in the streets, and you also have the chattering class and sort of the elites in the country seeing the problem the same way. And when the IMF says, United States, it's time to change your minimum wage, when you have CEOs coming out, CEOs of popular companies coming out and saying, we can't continue down this road, I think that's a recipe for profound change. Will it happen next year or 5 years from now? That's to be determined, but I think it will happen.
Who can sort of take the lead on this sort of thing? I mean, one of the things that bothers me is I do think that young people, in many cases, are not aware of the possibilities. They don't know what life was like, several decades ago. And you, in fact, wrote in Strap that I think the way you put it was that young people expected too little from society and too much from themselves. Explain what you meant by that, and then talk about who could sort of lead a transition almost in public consciousness on these issues.
Yeah, so the thing I talk about in the book is, our culture and our beliefs about who gets ahead and who doesn't has been, you know, for lack of a better word, Reaganized for my generation as well as the generation behind me. That idea that if you fail at something, it's because you made the wrong choice or didn't do something right is very prevalent, even among a new generation that, you know, wasn't alive for the most part when Reagan was president. So, you know, what we need is a leader that also champions the other side of the American ideal. We're always going to be strong individualists, but you know what? We also have a real history of collective action and believing in shared responsibility. And I think, you know, it doesn't have to be a leader from the millennial movement. It'd be great if it was, but I think, look at Mayor de Blasio, look at Senator Warren. You know, Elizabeth Warren has a following that is so much greater than her state of Massachusetts and has really become a national figure and provides that kind of optimism and straight talk that things didn't used to be this way. We've gone down a wrong path and we can get back on the right path. So I think we're starting to see a new generation of political leaders that are really willing to stand up and fight the system.
You know, I agree about the leadership void. As I go around the country, there seems to be a real hunger for leadership. That people feel that things can change. They're not sure how it might be able to change, and there's a sense of feeling helpless because they don't know what they as individuals can do. And it's sort of the leadership that's needed to rally the energy to pump these kind of folks up, so we can hope that that sort of thing comes along. I want to go back to this idea of debt-free college. If you could just wave a magic wand and so that things could be the way you think they should be, how should college be paid for in this country? We've got other countries where basically college is free. What should we do in the United States?
I think we need to go back to a debt-free system, which we had up until the mid to late 1990s. You know, it used to be the majority of people that went to state universities and colleges didn't have to go into debt. So low-income students could get a Pell Grant. We still have Pell Grants, but it used to cover, you know, $7 out of $10 of the cost of going to college. Today it covers $3 out of $10. So we need to go back to the fundamental value that we're going to help anybody who wants to go to college, is willing to do the work, be able to do so regardless of their family background or circumstances. And that's a promise we made in 1965. It's a promise we kept until the 1990s.
Why is college so expensive? I mean, are colleges really that much more valuable or that much more expensive to run than they were 40 years ago or half a century ago?
So I mostly look at what's happening in our public university system, because that's, you know, honestly where the majority of young people are going to go to get a college credential, and that will continue to be the case. So state funding, we have seen state funding per full-time student drop by 26% since 1980. So when that happens, these universities have to make it up somewhere else, and they make it up through raising tuition. That whole system, that starvation of public funding sets into place a lot of really bad thinking. You have public universities who now are trying to attract out-of-state residents, so they're going away from their mission of serving people in the state. They're going after international students. And the reason they do that, they want more revenues. So they go after the full payers, and the elite public institutions now see their competitors as the Ivy League of the really elite private institutions who have put into place this luxury arms race that is really, really having implications not only among the private institutions, but is really distorting the way public universities now view their mission. You know, if I'm a college in Pennsylvania, a state college, I now see that I have to compete with my private liberal arts neighbor, and so maybe I start spending money on things like dorm rooms or sushi bars or something like that. We've made a little bit too much about the rock climbing walls and those kinds of things. All of that decision-making, though, is being driven by a fundamental starvation of public resources.
Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I'd like to continue this conversation, and maybe we'll have you back. Tammy, thanks so much.
Thanks,
Tammy
Bob.
Draut of Demos. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. Tony Gwynn, one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball, died recently at the all too early age of 54. He had chewed tobacco throughout his career and died from cancer of the mouth. His death should be a wake-up call. More than 40,000 people are diagnosed with oral cancer in the U.S. every year. More than half of them will die within 5 years. Most of the rest will be grotesquely disfigured. Tobacco use in all its forms is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States. Cigarettes, cigars, chewing tobacco, they're all murderous products. I don't understand how the people who profit from that industry can bear to look at themselves. Cigarettes alone are responsible for the deaths of nearly 500,000 Americans annually, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And for every person who dies from smoking, there are 30 others who suffer some form of serious smoking-related illness. If I had my way, all forms of tobacco use would be banned. If you're a tobacco user, wise up. Give it up. That's it for now. See you next time.